The United Nations designated 2019 as International Year of Indigenous Languages. Hi there, welcome to a very special program and what we hope will be a series of conversations as we mark 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages. On January 19, 2019, the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs, with support of the Office of the Prime Minister and the University of Guyana, officially launched this year in Shalton Village in the South Rupununi. The University of Guyana, they've hosted two events in keeping with this international year, and now we are happy to begin this series of conversations, and we're quite delighted to have a very esteemed panel with us on this first conversation today. With us on my right is Professor Ian Robertson. He is a Guyanese linguist from the University of the West Indies. His area of expertise is Dutch Creole. And of course, Professor Robertson has come back as recent as last year to give a series of talks when we observed Indigenous Month, September last year, a series of interesting conversations. At the center of the panel is Ms. Charlene Wilkinson. She's a lecturer in the Department of Language and Cultural Studies at the University of Guyana, actively involved in language rights advocacy. And our third panelist today is Major General Retired Joe Singh. He is the University of Guyana's Pro-Chancellor. It's almost been a year for you now, Pro-Chancellor Joe Singh. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our conversation today. Our focus is on, today's focus is on Guyanese Creole. And so we'll begin our conversation by hearing from each of our panelists as to what is Guyanese Creole, or when we hear indigenous languages and Guyanese Creole, what are we talking about there? Let's get started with you, Professor Robertson.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, and in this kind of company I feel really at home. To start off with, Creole languages the world over, but in particular Creole languages of the Caribbean, are languages which developed in the region out of the meetings of people from basically West African cultures and European cultures. And in the case of Guyana in particular, Creolese, which is how the Guyanese variety is called, arose out of this regular need for a form of communication between and among the varying people who lived in the country in the earliest times. What is terribly important is the fact that it is these Creole languages are distinct varieties of languages with their own structures, their own grammatical practices, their own, to use a big word, semantic underpinnings. In other words, their own worldview, people who see the world in a particular way and rely on particular ways of expressing those things. So it is easily possible to describe a Creole language and to recognize how very different it is from the European languages from which they very often derive their basic word structures.
So Creolese is an indigenous language.
For me, Creolese is an indigenous language. There is some debate about the meaning of indigenous, but it is an indigenous language in the very sense that anything that is indigenous is something that arose naturally in a particular environment, so that the plants which are peculiar to the Guyanese or Caribbean, to any environment, are indigenous to that place. They may spread to other places, but they are indigenous to these places. And the Creole languages, certainly, Creolese developed here in Guyana, and there's no other place where this particular Creole would be spoken. There may be others that are similar, but no place in which this particular one was spoken. And I think the best example of that is, you mentioned Dutch Creole earlier on. Most of my work has been on a language called Berbice Dutch. It's a language that I myself discovered back in 1975 on the upper reaches of the Berbice River. And that language was spoken nowhere else but in Berbice. So it's indigenous, in my definition of indigenous.
Okay, and we'll certainly explore that and a whole lot more, if not in this conversation, in a series that we'll have throughout this year. Let's go across to you, Ms. Wilkinson. Guyanese Creole, Creolese language, and indigenous language as we celebrate the National Year of Indigenous Languages. Your interpretation on this?
Well, most certainly I support Professor Robertson, and what I'm conscious of now as a teacher, I call myself a teacher even though the designation is lecturer, is that we have to somehow bring that new awareness to the Guyanese people, because their concept of indigenous is what we used to call the Amerindian people. So when the Guyanese population hears that word, they think the nine nations, when they themselves are aware of the nine nations. We have an issue of us being an independent nation for so many decades, but on the coastland there's very little awareness about what we call about the Amerindian people. So we have several things to do as a university. We have to bring public awareness to who we are as a Guyanese people in our many varieties, what this language that we call Guyanese Creole means to us as a people, because no matter how far you travel in Guyana, you hear this language, you hear Creolese. Where at one time, maybe in the early days of our independence, you might not have heard it as much in the interior. You certainly hear more of it now. So as a university, I believe we have a responsibility to bring this public education. And this is why I really appreciate us being able to do this series with you.
Okay, and naturally we will have to explore all how we intend to do this, and it's not going to happen overnight, and who will be involved and what will be required and all of that. So interesting times ahead for us, but thank you for sharing. And so someone who's now at the helm of the University of Guyana's Pro-Chancellor, this is such an amazing time for you to be there as we celebrate our International Year of Indigenous Languages, having served and worked and traveled the length and breadth of this beautiful country of ours. Do you think we'll be able to capitalize on this moment and this observance, year-long observance?
Yeah, I do believe that. One correction, I'm not at the helm. The Vice Chancellor is at the helm. I'm in a supportive role. But thank you for asking me here, and I agree with all my colleagues. Having myself grown up in the country, my first language was Creolese until started going to school. At Ogle Sugar Estate, where I was born, we all spoke Creolese. And we went to school, we came back home, we spoke Creolese again. So it is, for all the reasons that Professor Ian Robertson gave, it is a language. It has its own syntax, its grammar, and so on. But I would like to look at it from an economic standpoint. I think it became an economic necessity. The planters and the people who were shipping slaves from Africa to here had to be able to communicate. When we came here, the African slaves and the plantation owners, and then when the Chinese and the Portuguese and the Indians came, you had a fusion. If you look at our language, there are many words in that what we call Creolese, which may have had their origin in the languages spoken by persons who arrived here as migrant labor. And I believe that for this reason, many of our communities in the rural areas and the hinterland areas, in communicating with them, we need to appreciate that their language, the way they speak, should not be looked down as in a derogatory sense. You should recognize that this is how they grew up and be able to communicate with them in a way that respects their language, and find a way, whether through interlocutors, to be able to get messages to them in a language that they understand and appreciate, rather than forcibly using the Queen's English, both in terms of conversation as well as in the textual information.
Mm-hmm. And one of in the mission of the UN and this international year, it is to bring attention on the risks of confronting indigenous languages, to protect them, to preserve them. And in another conversation, we will talk about the efforts that are already ongoing in this regard. But for the Creolese language, it's a bit different because in this case the Creolese language is a vibrant majority, if not all of Guyana, and Guyanese speak this language. So there's no danger in us needing now to preserve the Creolese language. What is it exactly we want to do with the Creolese language at this juncture?
Well, maybe before I agree with you totally, I should focus on the fact that while there is perhaps no danger in an absolute sense, there is certainly a lot of discrimination built into the system historically and for all kinds of socio-political reasons. There has always been some kind of discrimination against persons who speak Creolese or who don't have the control over the European language that is the official language of the country up to this point. And that is reflected not only in Ghana, throughout the region. Often people who appear in particular positions can be discriminated against simply because the language itself is not accepted in the official way that it should be. What then happens is that the speakers of the language themselves begin to feel less confident and are often less prepared to use the language in situations which can really work against their own best interests. Can you imagine going to see a Cuban doctor whose first language is Spanish and telling him that your belly is hurting you? All right? Your belly will hurt me. It's going to be a while before he can really understand the distinction that you're making on my foot, for instance. Right? I hurt my foot. Now, for us, a foot is anything from hip to toe. All right? And so easy to get that because it's not because it is wrong, it is because it is correct Creole. That's how the Creole community divides the body. And that's a simple example, but there are many. So what I am saying, in fact, is that even though the force of numbers will perhaps ensure it survives, I'm also saying that the level of discrimination can make it really lose its power within the society, and the confidence of the people who speak it and their comfort could be compromised.
Weigh in here now, Charlene. Your work at your particular unit in the University of Guyana is poised to use this platform of the International Year to really launch off into some genius plans we're hearing that you have already ongoing. The unit has been in existence for how long at the university?
Well, I must say that the unit has been in existence in my head for as long as I came back home, which is in 2008. It finally got recognized, it finally got the nod by the faculty last year, May 2017, which was a year after we had a colloquium on the languages of Guyana. The unit, however, still awaits the official endorsement of the powers that be. It still awaits that, and when the powers that be do that, they know that they have to give us a budget and the space. So I'm saying this to let people know that the structure of things is such that the status quo can remain and seem to remain in an innocent way, but unless we make this definite moves towards change, to say yes, endorse this language unit officially so that we could move towards giving it the economic support it needs. You know, you're not really supporting us. But, you know, what I wanted to say while Professor was talking is that as a teacher, I am extremely, we're speaking to you now in very good English and all of that. Occasionally, we may slip into Creolese. And those are expectations that were set up in us so long ago that we do it almost naturally. This is not the ability of the majority of our people, including our students at the University of Guyana. And unless that official move is made to recognize the language, to put teaching in place so that our students can feel that the powers that be do recognize the fact that they do speak a language other than English, I think we will have no matter what we do in the unit, no matter how much how many celebrations we have to make that official structure so that students can begin to be assessed, for example, in both languages. You know, if you keep suppressing the use of the Creolese, because it is suppressed, because everything they speak and write at the university, at secondary school, at primary school, is expected to be English. So there's an entire culture, an entire worldview, entire relationships that get locked out of the official system. I don't know how else I can put it, you know.
But even as you mentioned that, Charlene, what's currently, what are your offerings in that unit that is helping, you know, others and who are going through that unit to have that understanding and to also support not just you but the unit's work in what it is that you're trying to do?
Yes, well, the unit has amazingly got a course online, which is a summer, not online, on stream, which is a summer program in teaching Guyanese writing. How do you write in Creolese? So, of course, by doing that, we were able to bring in people who have written, like Ruplan Manar, one of the best Guyanese writers, and he writes entirely in Guyanese Creole. Back Down People, I can't remember the other one. He has two major novels. One is called Back Down People. I don't know if you remember the other one. So we were able to explore people who have written in Creolese, even if they've written in English but slipped in some Creolese within. We were able to explore that. And we recently a request was recently made of us for a full 15-week course in Guyanese Creole. It's not being offered right now because the program which asked for it has not started yet. But that is, I say that's a really forward move. So I don't want to create a pessimistic picture.
But beyond that program of writing in the Creolese, the unit has other offerings on a regular school year for the university. Let's say somebody's just watching us right now and they want to know what else they can do in that particular faculty of education and humanities, and in particular the Guyanese languages unit. What are some of the things we could
so
study?
far the Guyanese languages unit has been a support unit more for research.
Okay.
I'll say we've been visited by the University of Guyana Medical School, and they've requested us to teach their researchers how to write the Creole, because they were involved in a particular project where they had to go out into the communities and interview people. And they recognized right away that what they had to write wasn't English. And so when they heard about our existence. So that's one of the first bits of research we supported. And then they later on employed us to do transcriptions, which is to listen to the interviews and to write, to transcribe voice into text. So that is one of the things we've done. We have something else in the books, but I don't want to put it open too much, but it's an application for a grant for the documentation of the Lokono language, which is the language that we traditionally call Arawak language, but the people who we call Arawak prefer to be called Lokono. So we have applied for a grant to document that language, which is very endangered.
You're watching a special program today as we mark 2019 as International Year of Indigenous Languages. The focus today, interestingly, is on our Guyanese Creole with an esteemed panel. And just to recap who they are, Professor Ian Robertson, Charlene Wilkinson from the Department of Language and Cultural Studies at the University of Guyana, along with Major General Retired Joe Singh, the University of Guyana's Pro-Chancellor. And perhaps, Major General Joe Singh, if you could just take that hat off of being Pro-Chancellor and speak to a little bit about your experiences having worked across our other regions, all of our regions in the other time when you wore that hat as Major General, in service to our country. How did you find interacting with different groupings of people, indigenous people, persons existing in other regions, living in other regions, speaking with them and so forth? And what we are talking about, what we want to do in recognizing our indigenous languages, our Creolese, Guyanese language, and so forth, having had that experience, and now at this point where we're trying to bring it all together and make it into policy, make it into an endorsement of our policymakers, seeing that as a need now to document it and to accept it as a language. How necessary is that understanding of that experience of interacting with all the different types of people we have, our diversity?
Well, it's very necessary. I mean, in my military career, interacting with our soldiers, because they came from most of the regions at that time, I'm going back to the 1960s, and many of them, their first language was Creolese. So you had to be able to communicate with them in Creolese. Eventually, over time, as they were promoted or eligible to go on courses and so on, you had to build in remedial and compensatory education. But generally speaking, we spoke Creolese most of the time. So when we were in the interior, for example, the way we would speak with the pork knockers and speak with the Amerindian communities and the lumbermen and so on, we had to speak in their language. You couldn't go there because they'll ask you, why you so hoity-toity? Talk my language, they can't understand you. So it was a necessity to be able to communicate in that language. As we evolve since independence, we touched on the economics of it, but there's also a social cohesion aspect, which is very important. If we want to build social cohesion in this country, then we have to appreciate the dignity of labor. Wherever people came from, they have a role to play. And if we exclude them, not only are we denying them access, but we're also driving a wedge. They will feel inferior, that they're not capable of doing whatever it is. And I have found to the contrary. If you look at what has been happening recently in science and technology, and the extent to which rural and interior communities have been, in a sense, befriended by scientists who have come to Guyana to do research in whatever field it is, biodiversity and so on. Who do they learn from? They pick the brains of the persons who are familiar with the landscapes, familiar with the use of herbs, the use of various types of plants, and they go and write books about it and never, give credit to those persons whose brains they picked. We are now insisting that they be listed in the acknowledgements that this information came from persons who are knowledgeable, who may not, for them, English is not their first language, right? And the same applies when you speak with fishermen. You go into mangrove areas, you're planting mangroves, you can't speak proper English, what we call proper English. You have to speak in a language. So from the standpoint of economics, social cohesion, and access generally, I spoke with Charlene last year about the importance of, or the important role the university can play, languages department, in helping agencies like Guyana School of Agriculture, NARI, GLDA, and so on, who are interacting with farmers. Many of the persons coming out of those institutions, they can't converse with the farmers, and therefore there's some degree of polarization. There's a disconnect between the messages that we want to communicate and the way in which we communicate. The communication tools, the way we speak, the textual information, the diagrammatic information must pay cognizance of the fact that we're dealing and we're interacting with people whose first language is not the Queen's English, as we call it. And they must therefore make provision for this generally. The Carnegie School of Home Economics, the Cyril Potter College, these are all institutions who are interacting with large numbers of people, adults as well as children. And if we do not recognize that we are imposing on them a different type of language And if we're not accommodating when I say accommodating, allowing them to express themselves so that they don't feel overwhelmed. And there's a gradual process of being able to not lose their Creolese, but to gain English, because when you're sitting exams, the exams are not written in Creolese. So you have to have a transitional period to increase the comfort level of students in kindergarten and primary school, and allow them space to be able to communicate and to feel comfortable with that transition.
I knew when we got started there'd be so much I'd want to jump off from, but this is just, as mentioned earlier, we're establishing it because we hope that we will continue to engage. I think we've got off to a really positive footing with the panel that we've had today. But we only have 5 minutes remaining on the clock, friends, so we'll have to go around to hear your closing comments. And our next steps, having had this very general discussion around Guyanese Creolese, what would be our next step as a country? I'm asking a very tough question on you there, Professor, but what should we be thinking and doing next?
There's an English writer in a book called Howard Zinn, who says there are no simple questions and there are no simple answers. So, but what I would focus on would be the need for a much more heightened level of language awareness across the region, across the nation, as a means of empowering people. And that implies that one does not have to lose power by giving access to the range of languages. I mean, we've talked about Creolese, but Charlene did mention Lokono, and there's so many other languages available in the country that we need to be able to recognize the power of each of them. We know from education fact, and this is established fact, that students learn better, people learn better in their first language. That's a fact. So if we don't bear that in mind, we shut them out.
Well, thank you for that. So increasing awareness. So this is just one tiny step that we certainly can do more of. Charlene, you've got 1 minute though.
Well, for me, our agenda has to be very clear. Are you trying to make allowances for people who speak Creole so that eventually they become properly educated, leave the Creole behind, and get more English? Or are you trying to create a sense of real equality between the two languages? Let me give you a good example, maybe a little amusing example too. Guyanese people have a way of saying, when you were speaking about botany, and so I remembered it, when they discover what the Latin name for something is, they would say, well, we just call it so, but the real name is this. And they would give the Latin name. Why is the name we calling it not also the real name? When we can get to that level of awareness that our naming and the naming of the Latin words, the naming of the Guyanese words, same naming, but from two different worldviews. And both of those worldviews are just as valid as each other. The first one, the naming of the Guyanese things, that's our world. And there's nothing wrong with walking in two worlds without having to give up the one you came from. You see? That's what I say, the agenda has to be very clear. We are not leaving Creolese behind in any way. We're not pushing it behind to get to English. Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya recently was interviewed, and he said, you know what? They're fighting in Africa too for other languages. Because the same thing happened in Africa, much wider scale, where the European languages were official languages, but not the native African languages. And he says, control English, but don't let English control you.
Okay. All right, Charlene, and 30 seconds for Chancellor.
Well, I feel we should celebrate our Creolese. Yes. I mean, how many youngsters study Wordsworth McAndrew? And when you express yourself in Oleg, using the Creolese, it's much more easily understood than if you try to convert Wordsworth McAndrew into Queen's English. So I think we need to use the opportunity to celebrate. And secondly, capture the older people and the interpretation that they've given to the language. they're dying out very quickly, and the university can play a role in recording and preserving and archiving and researching. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Robertson, Charlene Wilkinson, and Major General Retired Pro-Chancellor of UG, Joseph Singh. Thank you very much for tuning into this first conversation. As we promise you, there's going to be a series as we celebrate and observe 2019 as International Year of Indigenous Languages. Today we looked at Guyanese Creole. Thank you so much.
Thank you.